not knights, not kings, but the silent millions who fed empires and vanished without a word. Tonight, we step into their muddy shoes. The screen is dark. Faint mist curls across a lonely country road. The sound of hooves in the distance fades gently into silence. Welcome. You've arrived at a quiet threshold between the world you know and one nearly forgotten. Tonight, we travel not to the gilded courts of kings, nor to the cathedrals raised in marble and stained glass, but into the earth-worn footsteps of those who lived where history rarely lingers. This is not a tale of conquest or glory. This is the story of those who toiled beneath the banners. The peasants of medieval Europe. Close your eyes now, if you haven't already, and imagine yourself walking along a muddy path in the year 1272. The sun has just set behind a thick bank of clouds, casting the village in a cool, gray hush. The air is damp with the scent of soil, freshly turned for planting. A thatched roof drips with the last of the evening rain. Somewhere far off, a church bell calls out gently, its tone softened by the fog that hugs the earth like a blanket. There are no maps that show this place, no statues erected in these people's names, but still, they lived, they laughed, they wept, and they worked, building a world from wood, stone, and will. Their stories are rarely told, but tonight we listen. Let us begin our quiet journey with the land itself, the world that shaped their days and gave rise to their way of life. In the quiet stillness before memory, the land was everything. Before lords and levees, before prayers in stone chapels, there was the curve of the hills, the softness of moss beneath the trees, and the slow unfolding of each season. The medieval peasant did not live apart from the land. They lived within it, cradled by its gifts, bound by its rhythms, and shaped by its unyielding patience. Tonight, let us begin here with the world that breathed alongside them. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a village path. The year is 1272. Morning has not quite broken, and the sky is a soft indigo sheet above you. The air carries the gentle hush of dew, and the scent of wet thatch and freshly turned earth lingers all around. Somewhere far off, a cockerel stirs, and the earth seems to exhale. This village, like countless others, was not born by grand design. It was not placed by a ruler's command or marked on early maps. Grew where the land allowed it near water, near shelter, on a rise that caught the sun just long enough to grow barley and lentils, yet low enough to shield from biting winds. Geography was not backdrop, was destiny. Across England, France, and the Germanic lands, most peasant settlements nestled themselves near streams or rivers. The water was essential not just for drinking and cooking, but for life itself. Animals needed it, crops depended on it. Children played along its banks, and women knelt to scrub cloth against smooth river stones. The sounds of splashing water became as familiar as breath. But rivers were not always gentle. Spring rains could swell their banks, and floods were cruel reminders that nature gave with one hand and took with the other. Where rivers did not reach, wells were dug narrow windows into the earth's secret reserves. These too were precious and often shared between families or neighborhoods. A well might be the center of whispered gossip, the place where laughter echoed on warm afternoons or tears were shed in solitude. The forests, vast and ancient, loomed at the edges of fields like silent watchers. Peasants entered them with purpose and with respect. These woodlands were places of sustenance and stories, timber for homes and fuel, mushrooms and nuts, herbs for healing, and occasionally meat if one dared risk hunting where the Lord's laws forbade. The forest gave generously, but it also held shadows. Wolves were not mere legend in these centuries, nor were the whispered tales of wandering spirits, green men, or silent figures glimpsed only in the corners of one's eye. Still, the people went, baskets in hand, heads bowed beneath low branches, guided more by memory than map. Each region of medieval Europe presented its own unique dialogue with the land. In the lowlands of northern France, the soil was rich but damp, requiring careful management to prevent rot and mold. In the hills of Tuscany, terraces carved into slopes allowed vineyards to thrive. In Scandinavia, where winters were long and the ground often frozen, the people relied on hardy root vegetables, smoked fish, and reindeer. Homes were built close together, insulated with turf and lined with pelts, not out of luxury, but necessity. In the low-lying Netherlands, the fight was against the sea itself. Dikes and levees, early marvels of human engineering, held back tides that had no master. Entire communities worked in rhythm to maintain them. We was not a private matter, it was a communal threat, and unity was born from the need to survive. To the east, across the vast Hungarian plain, winds blew without end. There, the land seemed endless, flat and open, and peasants adapted to its extremes with portable dwellings and grazing cultures. Their lives were not anchored in stone, but in movement, following herds, seasons, and old stories passed across generations. Even within one country, the land divided lives. A peasant in the marshy fenlands of East Anglia faced a different world from one on the chalky downs of southern England. The former contended with wet feet, biting insects, and the constant hum of frogs. The latter with dry winds, sparse trees, and the challenge of thin, flinty soil. Peasants knew the land the way a sailor knows the sea, not as something owned, but something endured, something read with care. The coming of spring was not marked on a calendar, but in the opening of buds, the migration of birds, the scent of green returning to the wind. Winter's onset was seen in the flight of geese, the stiffening of puddles, and the silence that fell after harvest. Work followed this natural rhythm. Kia fields were tilled with wooden plows, oxen groaning as they strained against the resistance of winter-packed soil. Kia center crops demanded constant attention, weeding and watering done beneath a sun that offered little mercy. Autumn brought the harvest urgent, brief, and vital. It was the year's reckoning, and winter. Winter was a season of survival, a time for repair, for storytelling, for enduring. The land also held its scars, traces of human adaptation etched slowly over time. Ancient raj and furrow fields, shaped by repeated plowing, still ripple across some countryside today. Dry stone walls crisscross pastures like lines in a palm, guiding livestock and marking invisible boundaries of memory and tradition. Capiced woodlands, carefully managed for firewood, showed a rhythm of regrowth that stretched beyond lifetimes. And yet, there was beauty here, a quiet, unassuming beauty. The hush of snowfall on a thatched roof, the glow of wheat under a setting sun, the first green shoot in a frost-broken garden. For peasants, beauty was not something sought. It simply arrived, draped in the ordinary, folded into the day. Their interaction with the environment was shaped as much by caution as by gratitude. Crop rotation became common practice, not out of scientific understanding, but from experience, hard-won. Leave one field fallow, and it would return stronger. Overwork it, and the earth would punish you. Peasants learned these lessons, not in books, but in hunger. And yet, despite this closeness, the land could still betray them. A late frost could kill seedlings overnight. A summer storm could drown entire harvests. Swarm of locusts, a fungus in the rye, or the silent creeping of mold in a grana reach could spell disaster. Nature was not romanticized. Tia was not an enemy nor a friend. It was simply life. Today, archaeologists piece together this bond between people and place, not through scrolls or chronicles, but through soil samples, pollen grains, and ghost lines in the earth. What remains is quite a discolored patch where a post once stood, clay hearthstone blackened by centuries of flame, or shards of pottery crushed beneath layers of time. In these fragments, we find echoes of how the land shaped not just survival, but identity. You rest here, imagining the slow, deliberate pace of life lived close to the earth. Consider this. For the medieval peasant, the land was not something separate to observe. It was a partner in hardship, a witness to whispered prayers, a keeper of secrets. And though their names have faded, the marks they left remain, pressed softly into the earth, like the lingering warmth of a hand. Let us now leave the open field behind. The wind has picked up slightly, carrying with it the distant scent of wood smoke. A small gate creaks as you push it open. Ahead lies a narrow path, its edges grown wild with herbs and nettles. A cottage waits at the end, its roof low, its walls leaning slightly, its door ajar. Inside, a hearth glows, and voices murmur low. It is time to step inside. Step quietly now. The ground beneath your feet is packed with years of use, trampled by bare soles and calloused heels, smooth by time and repetition. You pass through the doorway of a medieval peasant's home. It is low, made of wood and wattle, the plastered walls dulled by soot and age. The door creaks shut behind you, and the world outside fades into a hushed interior. There is no hallway, no separation between one life and the next. You are already in the main room, a space that serves as kitchen, bedroom, dining hall, workshop, birthing chamber, and shelter from the storm. The ceiling is low, and you instinctively duck your head. Thin beams cross overhead, blackened by years of smoke, curling up from the hearth below. The hearth is the center, not just of the home, but of life itself. Its fire is rarely allowed to die, and beside it sits a pot, always simmering stew or porridge, whatever could be gathered or spared. The stones around it are warm to the touch, and above it, a hole in the roof allows smoke to rise in slow spirals. Yet, despite this clever escape, the air is thick, perfumed with wood smoke, damp wool, and humanity. The floor is dirt, hard-packed and uneven. It bears the impressions of tools, stools, feet. It smells faintly of hay, of damp cloth, of cooking fat. There are rushes scattered across it, dried grasses, sometimes scented with herbs like lavender, mint, or sweet flag, meant to mask less pleasant odors. They are replaced only occasionally, and as you walk, they rustle softly beneath your steps. To one side is a sleeping area, though the word may be too generous. It consists of straw-filled mattresses, often shared. Blankets of wool, stitched with care, may cover 2 or more sleepers. Grandparents, infants, and parents all huddled together beneath the same layer. Warmth, not privacy, is the luxury here. The livestock, too, may be nearby, kept within reach during bitter nights, not just for their value, but for the heat they offer. Furniture is sparse. A small table, uneven and sturdy, stands near the wall. Around it are stools made from cut logs or simple boards nailed together. A chest may sit in the corner, rare and valuable. Inside, linens passed down from mother to daughter, or perhaps a treasured cloak, or a small wooden carving kept since childhood. Possessions are few, and each one tells a story. Some items are repaired again and again, not discarded, but preserved. Shelves may be built into the walls, planks of wood braced between posts holding earthenware bowls, wooden spoons, and carefully hoarded salt. Oil lamps made of clay flicker gently, casting light that seems to breathe. Candles, if they exist, are made from tallow and release a bitter, fatty scent when lit. Nights are dim and vision is limited. Tasks slow. Voices lower. Against one wall, bundles of herbs hang from beams to dry sage, thyme, yarrow, and others, gathered by women who learn from their mothers and grandmothers, which leaves soothe the stomach, and which roots help bring sleep. In this house, healing is passed down through memory, not written in books. There are no doctors here, only wisdom, often quiet and unquestioned. In some regions, like the colder north of England or the foothills of the Alps, homes are constructed partially below ground, dug into the earth to conserve warmth. Turf roofs offer insulation and sometimes even sprout wildflowers. In sunnier southern regions, walls might be built from sun-dried mud bricks or rough stones, carefully stacked and sealed with lime and clay. If the family is fortunate, a second room may exist. A loft, perhaps, reached by a ladder or step. It might store grain, tools, or provide a slightly more private place for rest. But most lived simply with one room, one fire, one roof, tea. And that roof, the roof, thatched from straw or reeds, carefully layered and tied. It breathes with the weather, lets in light, and sometimes rain. Birds may nest in its eaves. Mice may scurry above, just living in its own way, sheltering and shifting with time. Cleanliness is not taken for granted. There are no bathtubs, only wooden basins and cloths. Water is fetched in buckets from the nearest stream or well, and is used sparingly. Soap, if made, is a precious thing rendered from ash and fat. Still, hands are washed before meals. Faces are wiped. Children are cleaned with care. Cleanliness, like everything else, is an active effort. Just beyond the door, perhaps behind the home or near a hedge, is a simple, privy little more than a wooden bench over a pit. It is modest, shielded from view, and shared. Waste is sometimes composted into fields. The cycle of life and soil continues. Not far from the house, perhaps across a short stretch of trampled grass, is a shed or pen for animals. Chickens, goats, perhaps a pig. They are not just food, they are wealth, mobility, insurance. A lost chicken is not a small thing. This means one less egg, one more hunger. In bitter winters, animals may be brought indoors. Their heat is precious, and their nearness oddly comforting. Outside the home, small gardens bloom in quiet corners. Turnips, leeks, onions, cabbage. These are not ornamental gardens, but living pantries. Weeds are pulled, not for aesthetics, but survival. Each seed planted is a whisper of hope. Each sprout, a promise. Children run barefoot across muddy lanes, their voices sharp in the morning air. Inside, women spin wool, repair clothing, and tend to cooking. Men mend tools, sort grain, or build fences. In this space, small, smoky, and unadorned world exists. Love, grief, laughter, and exhaustion all share the same firelight. The home is not only shelter, it is ritual. The way bread is baked, the way the door is latched, the prayer said before sleep. The way a baby is wrapped in cloth passed down from 3 generations. Every corner holds meaning. When a child is born, it is here. When an elder takes their final breath, it is here. The house remembers. Its walls have seen joy and mourning alike. The creak of the same beam may have echoed with lullabies and, years later, with whispered goodbyes. These are not empty structures. They are lived in memory. Though modern eyes may call it crude or lacking, this home carries generations of knowledge. Every beam placed by hand, every crack stuffed with straw and clay. Hey, it is a place made by memory, maintained by care, and filled with endurance. And when night falls, as it often does, too early in winter, the heart's glow becomes the heart's rhythm. Shadows stretch long. The fire crackles softly. Children curl beside their mothers. And the world narrows into this small space warmed, worn, and waiting for morning. Now that we've sat beside their fire, walked their floor, and rested in their silence, let us turn our attention to what sustains them. For all the labor in the field and warmth of the hearth, the medieval peasant's life was a constant quest for food. There is a rhythm to hunger. It is not frantic or loud. It does not always roar. For the medieval peasant, it is a quieter thing, a slow ache at the edge of the day, a question that must be answered not once, but always. Food was not a convenience. It was a pursuit. And so much of life, from dawn to dusk, revolved around the simple act of feeding oneself and one's family. Imagine yourself waking just before sunrise, the sky still touched by night. The fire is coaxed back to life from embers buried in ash. Its warmth is not only comforting, it is the beginning of nourishment. A pot is set to boil. A thin porridge of oats or barley, cooked slowly, sometimes with milk if the cow is generous that week, a bit of salt if there is any left, perhaps a dried apple saved from last autumn. The medieval diet was built from what could be grown nearby and stored without spoilage. The staples were simple. Barley, rye, and oats formed the base of bread and porridge. Beans and peas added protein, while onions, leeks, and cabbage provided a rare sharpness to the tongue. These were humble ingredients, but they held life. Wheat, though common in upper classes, was less available to peasants. Bread made from it was light and white. Peasant bread was darker, denser, chewier. It filled the stomach and stayed there. Cooking was a slow, patient craft. There were no metal stoves, no regulated flames. Instead, meals were made in iron cauldrons hung above open fires or clay ovens built from earth. Most cooking was one pot: stews, soups, and porridges that could stretch ingredients and keep for days. Flavor came from herbs, not spices. Spices were rare, expensive, often reserved for the tables of lords or the shelves of apothecaries. A pinch of pepper or cinnamon was more precious than gold to most. Wooden spoons stirred the pots, and meals were eaten from shared bowls. Individual plates were rare. Often, bread served as both vessel and food. Fingers were the primary tools. Washing hands before meals was a sign of respect, not just hygiene. In some villages, communal ovens served many families. These stone ovens, heated with wood fires until scorching, then swept clean before the dough was placed inside, were precious community assets. Bread dough, prepared at home, was carried in baskets and marked with symbols or cuts, so it could be retrieved later without confusion. The smell of baking bread, drifting from the oven, became the scent of togetherness. The church's calendar deeply shaped what could be eaten and when. Over 140 days each year were designated as fasting days when meat, dairy, and sometimes even eggs were forbidden. This wasn't always a burden. For many peasants, such luxuries were rare regardless, but it imposed a rhythm of spiritual discipline that reminded even the hungriest of their place in the divine order. Supplemental food came from the wild. Mushrooms foraged carefully, honey gathered from hives or hollow trees, fish from rivers, birds caught in traps. Children were often tasked with these 4 Esquire searches through fields and woods for eggs, snails, berries, or nuts. Their small hands and bright eyes made them perfect cleaners. Meat was rare and often ceremonial. A chicken might be slaughtered for a wedding, a pig for a festival. The entire animal was used, nothing wasted. Salted and hung, meat could be preserved for months. A single piece might be added to a stew, more as seasoning than substance. Most days, protein came from legumes, or perhaps a bit of cheese if the cow was still producing. Ale was more common than clean water, brewed in small batches, often by the women of the household. It was weak by modern standards, but nourishing. The grain left after brewing could feed pigs or be mixed into bread. Drinking ale was not indulgence. It was survival. Milk, if available, was consumed quickly before spoiling or turned into butter or cheese. Butter, especially in the north, was treasured use not only in cooking, but for barter or healing wounds. Cheese, aged and hardened, could last through lean months. Women held knowledge of fermentation, baking, and preservation. Men built the smokehouses and dug root cellars. Children stirred pots and carried baskets. Each role, each act, was woven into a web of survival. Meals were not simply nourishment. They were events of memory. Recipes were never written, but remembered in hands, in repetition, in taste, passed down. And with food came meaning. Love of bread was not just sustenance. It was labor transformed into life. A pot of soup was the echo of shared endurance. A feast, when it came, was not merely indulgencing. It was a moment of relief, a chance to breathe deeply, to laugh more loudly, to let the shoulders rest. Oral traditions bloomed around food. Blessings were said before eating. Riddles and stories told while stirring pots. Accompanied tales of saints, heroes, or the old woman who lived alone and knew the mushrooms that whispered. Meals bound families together, even when ingredients were meager. Hunger united them as deeply as blood. And then the silence after. The last crumbs brushed from a rough table. The bowls wiped clean with crusts. The fire damped. The belly not quite full, but satisfied. And sleep, arriving slowly to the rhythm of survival. This was the medieval peasant's daily quest. Not one of conquest or glory, but of gathering, preparing, and sharing. Food was not abundance, it was persistence. It was memory. It was resilience made edible. And now, as our breath slows and the firelight dims again in our minds, let us rise from the table, not hurriedly, but gently in. Walk once more into the broader shape of their world. A world not ruled by food alone, but by structure, power, obligation. The next step in our journey leads us into the hands of those who governed and those who served. Let us go there now quietly, beneath the quiet rhythm of village life, beneath the labor of planting, harvesting, and baking. There was another rhythm, one not measured in seasons, but in duty. It was not written on the sky or carved into the soil. It was understood, accepted, sometimes feared, sometimes quietly questioned. It was the structure of power. Imagine the village from above, seen not with your eyes, but through the eyes of the system that governed it. It is part of a manor, and that manor is part of a fief, which in turn belongs to a lord, who swears loyalty to a higher lord, perhaps even a king. This was the world of feudalism, layer upon layer of authority, built like an invisible staircase with the peasant at the lowest step, its shoulders hunched, carrying the weight of all above. Feudalism was not simply government. It was a relationship. It was an agreement, enduring, inescapable. At its heart was land. All land belonged to the king, in theory. From him, it passed down like a gift wrapped in obligation. A noble might be granted a great tract of earth in return for soldiers and loyalty. That noble, in turn, granted portions of it to knights or vassals, and so on. But the ones who worked the land, the ones who made it truly live, were the peasants. Most peasants were serfs, though not all. A serf was not a slave, but neither was he free. He could not leave the land without permission. His labor belonged partly to the lord, as did a portion of his harvest. His children, too, were often bound to the same estate. Free peasants existed, usually in more remote or urban areas, and they held more autonomy, but they, too, paid rents, owed services, and navigated a world shaped by others. The peasant's calendar was crowded, not just with planting and reaping, but with obligations. There was Labor Days, when one worked the Lord's fields instead of his own. There were tithes to the church, 1/10 of one's produce, offered to sustain those who prayed. There were rents to pay, often in grain, chickens, or cloth. There were fees for using the mill, the oven, the pasture. A coin dropped here, a measure of barley there. Always something owed, and watching over it all was the manor. Not merely a house, but the administrative heart of rural life. The manor house itself, larger than any village home, stood apart. Its wooden beams were broader, its walls thicker, its fire hotter. It housed not only the lord's family when they visited, but the instruments of oversight. The reeve, often a peasant appointed to enforce rules among his neighbors, was the first line of order. He knew every furrow, every boundary stone. He settled small disputes, ensured labor was done, and often walked a line between loyalty to the manor and mercy to his kin. A good reeve could soften burdens. A cruel one could make a season unbearable. Then came the bailiff lean, observant, rarely smiling. He carried the weight of numbers. He knew who owed what, who delayed, who overharvested. With a ledger in hand and quiet authority, he passed through the village, not as one of them, but as the manor's eyes and ears. A missing chicken, a broken fence, a rumor of withheld grain were noted. Above them was the steward, distant, sometimes literate, always calculating. He reported to the lord or lady who might reside leagues away in stone comfort. It was the steward who planned leases, arranged collections, and answered to royal messengers. Few peasants knew him well. Fewer still dared speak to him. Justice, too, was dispensed at the manor. On feast days or designated court days, villagers gathered in the clearing or hall. There, before a wooden bench, disputes were aired. Boundary quarrels, thefts, accusations of gossip or blasphemy. Witnesses spoke. The reeve testified, and judgment fell sometimes heavy-handed. Fines were common. Stocks, though feared, were not rare. Yet even justice carried its rituals, its memories, its cautionary tales. There was the tale of Ellsworth, who dared accuse the miller of taking extra flour. She won, surprisingly, and became a quiet village legend. There was the boy who stole apples from the lord's orchard, not out of hunger, but mischief and spent 3 days in the stocks, down as neighbors passed without meeting his gaze. And the widow who cried foul over a land demarcation, her voice rising above the silence. Her claim failed, but her courage lingered. Military service, though not demanded of most peasants, touched them still. When banners were raised, supplies were gathered. Young men vanished for seasons, pressed into service, or hired to cart provisions. Horses were taken, carts borrowed and not returned. And when the war came close, it left marks burnt fields, trampled hedgerows, stories whispered late into the night. Women in this network held quiet power. A mother knew which child bore resemblance to which lord. A midwife knew what herbs could dull pain or cause silence. A brewer's wife might smooth tensions between households with a warm jug of ale and a kind word. And when hardship struck failed harvest, injured son, unjust tax, it was often the women who bore the pain in silence, who carried water by dawn, and who sang lullabies to sleeping children while their husbands negotiated with the bailiff. There were, of course, limits. A serf might not own a horse. A peasant might not hunt deer. One could be fined for cutting wood in the wrong forest, for gathering mushrooms in forbidden glades. Power was written in what one could not do. But memory kept score, too. Stories of lenient lords, of unfair punishments, of quiet rebellions. They were passed like bread, shared like fire. And yet, most days were not filled with punishment or defiance. They were filled with doing, with waking, working, enduring, with knowing one's place, and slowly, sometimes painfully, shaping what dignity could be found within it. The village was not only bound by law, but by custom, by understanding, by centuries of survival. This was not a time of freedom, but it was a time of structure, and within that structure, people lived. They married, they laughed, they carried sorrow. They offered one another kindness, even as the world above pressed pressed his thumb down. In the distance, the bell might ring for court, for prayer, for alarm, but in the field, the plow moved forward. In the cottage, the fire burned low. And in the heart of each villager, some part remained free, the will to endure, to remember, and to pass on the story of how they lived, not as kings or lords, but as people. And so we leave the realm of feudal bonds and step now into another presence in their world, more intimate, more invisible, and often more feared, the presence of sickness, the weight of fever, the mystery of the body. Let us walk into the hush of the sick room, into the riddle of medieval illness and the tender hope of healing. The soft hush of a medieval village evening carried more than the rustle of wind through thatch and trees, carried the quiet presence of illness, an unseen, uninvited guest that slipped into cottages and cradles alike. In the world of medieval peasants, health was not merely the absence of pain. It was a fleeting state, always vulnerable to shift, like a candle flickering in a restless breeze. There were no hospitals as we know them, no antiseptics, and no certainty. And yet, within these boundaries, people lived, loved, suffered, and hoped. Imagine yourself in a small cottage on the edge of the fields. The air is still, touched faintly by the scent of boiled herbs and damp wood. A child lies in the crook of their mother's arm, flushed with fever. The mother hums softly a lullaby she once heard from her own mother. There is no doctor to call. Instead, healing rests in the weathered hands of the village healer, the midwife, or a neighbor with knowledge of plants and prayer. Common illnesses were not always named, but they were deeply felt. Fevers came suddenly, with chills and trembling. The stomach could betray a family after one poor meal. Dysentery, the bloody flux, as it was sometimes whispered, was a grim reality when water turned foul. Skin rashes, festering wounds from minor cuts, and lung complaints from smoky interiors were familiar, feared, and endured. A toothache, left to rot, could change a person's temperament forever. A twisted ankle might never fully heal. Each malady was a reminder that the body was fragile and the world indifferent. And yet, these sufferings were not seen through the lens of bacteria or viruses. Instead, sickness was interpreted through belief. Many thought illness came from an imbalance of the body's humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile leach associated with traits and temperaments. Choleric person might burn with fever because their yellow bile was in excess. A melancholic spirit, pale and cold, might struggle in winter due to too much black bile. This framework, inherited from ancient writings, was not superstition to them, it was logic. It was the rhythm of their understanding, passed through generations. Others saw disease as divine punishment or moral test. A lingering cough could be the result of unconfessed sin. A stillborn child might be explained as a family's failure to tithe or attend Mass. In this context, healing was not only a matter of plants and potions, but of prayer and penance. Shrines to saints were visited, relics were kissed, holy water sprinkled. The faithful might make pilgrimages to far-off chapels, walking miles on foot in the hope that proximity to sanctity would restore the body. In the quiet core of the village, a handful of individuals carried the burden of tending to the sick. The herbalist often, an older woman, sometimes eyed with suspicion, sometimes revered, kept bundles of dried leaves, bark, and root. Mugwort for digestion, yarrow to slow bleeding, honey, sweet and golden, used to soothe and to seal. It's garlic, not just for flavor, but for its pungent strength against invisible forces. Leeching, though unpleasant, was believed to rebalance the humors. Poultices, made from bread and vinegar, wrapped in linen, or applied to abscesses. Warmth and rest, when they could be afforded, were administered gently by family and neighbor alike. Childbirth loomed large in the shadow of health. a moment of new life that arrived with a sharp awareness of death. Women gave birth at home, attended by midwives who had delivered dozens, if not hundreds, before. There were no surgical options, no pain relief beyond cloth and hand. A child born at dawn might see only dusk. A mother's final breath might be taken in a room filled with whispered prayers and clutching hands. And yet, life continued. Another child would come, another prayer spoken. The cycle endured. When illness took its toll, there were quiet rituals of parting. A candle might be lit beside the dying, the flickering flame a companion to the fading breath. The village bell would toll, slowly, one chime for each year of a life. Final words were often whispered, not shouted regrets and blessings passed to those who remained. A wooden cross, a shroud, and a simple grave marked the end. The soil took back what the village could no longer hold. In such times, the community responded not with grand ceremony, but with quiet presence. A coup might be brought to the bereaved. Children hushed their games near mourning homes. Stories were told of others who had passed, not in sadness, but in reverence. Grief was not a storm to be weathered alone, but a shared winter, softened by the warmth of others. Amid this vulnerability, there was resilience, not the loud, heroic kind, but the steady, enduring sort. The resilience of mothers who buried children and still rocked cradles. The resilience of men who limped from old injuries and still turned to soil. The resilience of elders who remembered plague years, but still sat by hearths and told stories. And in the face of every illness, there remained one truth. The body might break, but the soul could still be whole. Even when understanding failed, when remedies proved powerless, and when prayers went unanswered, the villagers lived on. Not because they believed suffering was noble, but because they had no choice. And because, in small acts of kindness, of tending, of feeding, of remembering, they stitched hope into the fabric of their days. As we leave this shadow chamber of medieval health, the air cools slightly. Outside, a wind stirs the hedgerows. The village sleeps, as it has for centuries, under the silent stars, fragile, uncertain, but quietly enduring. And still, illness was not always a storm. Sometimes it arrived like a mist, unremarkable until it was all around. Sometimes illness did not come with a name, came with a silence in the morning, when a child who once laughed now stared blankly at the wall, came with shivers in summer, with skin hot to the touch, with eyes that grew dull no matter how tightly a hand held on. There were times when the village would speak of the evil wind or the night sickness, ailments that arrived quietly and departed suddenly, leaving behind confusion and grief. A young woman might fall ill after a dream she could not explain, or a man after returning from a forest path others avoided. And just as easily, some healed without remedy, feeding superstition further. It was not her time. People would whisper, as if death followed a calendar only it could read. Some of the most feared illnesses carried marks upon the skin. Coughs were endured, but when boils appeared, or a rash spread fast and dark, fear took root. Kakor's smallpox was especially dreaded. It left a face pitted like a dried seed pod. Some survived, scarred but stronger. Others did not. And then there was leprosy called by many names. None kind. It turned skin pale and numb, fingers thin and twisted. The afflicted were sometimes isolated, not out of cruelty, but confusion. A small chapel beyond the village might house them, where they rang small bells to signal their presence and lived half seen, half forgotten. Even animals played their part in medieval sickness. A bite from a rabid dog might bring on madness, snarling, trembling, frothing, and then death. Children were told to keep away from foaming mouths and limping beasts. And yet, the dog was also a protector, sleeping at the door of the sick, its body curled close to the cold. inside the peasant home, sickness changed everything. The hearth, usually bright with embers and the scent of porridge or stewed greens, took on the aroma of poultices and damp cloth. Light dimmed, not because the sun failed, but because shutters stayed closed. A jug of water might sit untouched. A bowl of herbs grew brown. The rhythmic sound of a scythe or a spinning wheel was replaced by breathing, labored, shallow, erratic. Sometimes it was the breathing of the ill. Sometimes it was the breath of those who watched, unable to sleep, afraid to hope. Children did not understand illness the way adults did, but they felt its weight. A child might sit beside their parent, tracing a pattern in the dirt floor, listening for changes in the tone of a whispered prayer. Others ran errands fetching water, gathering kindling, delivering messages to neighbors. They were small carriers of care, unnoticed but vital. And when death came, they were often the last to be told. Yet they already knew, in their bones, suffering could unite a household or hollow it. Families drew close, sitting beside beds, taking turns with wet cloths and quiet songs. But there were times when the fear of contagion or the burden of despair grew too large. A neighbor might stop visiting. A friend might stay by the door, calling but not entering. The sick room became its own world, governed by breath and silence and the unspoken ticking of time. Death, when it arrived, was not always a stranger. It had come before and would return again. But each time, it left something different behind. In the ritual of death, there was rhythm. A priest summoned if one could be spared. Last words if the ill could still speak. A candle lit at the head, and a bell rung to mark the passing. A simple sheet, a wooden cross, procession of feet in the soil, and a return, always, to work, because the fields did not pause for mourning. Yet even here, in grief, there were small rebellions of love. A woman might carve a symbol into the handle of her husband's spade, hanging it in the rafters instead of reusing it. A child might tuck a small flower into the corner of their sister's grave, returning to replace it each week until snow fell. Memory was not grand, but it was persistent, and so illness was not just a moment of suffering. It was a cycle of interruption and return. The village paused, wept, whispered, and then, as always, it moved on. The soil was turned. The cows were milked. The children laughed again. But something had shifted, however small. A place at the table. A voice in the choir. A shadow in the sunlight. To live in the medieval world was to live beside uncertainty. Health was not a promise, but a gift. And like all gifts, it could be taken. But amid this fragility, people built routines, comforts, and faith. Tamed to herbs and hymns, to hot broth and holy relics, to the feel of a familiar hand. As we step out of this chapter and into the next, the village breathes slowly. The sick room is quiet now. A breeze moves through the shutters. Somewhere, a pot of rosemary simmers gently on the fire. And beneath the quiet hum of evening, life begins again. The rhythm of a medieval peasant's life was not dictated by clocks or appointments, but by the rising and setting of the sun, the tolling of distant bells, the whisper of wind in the thatch, and the aching of muscles well used. Time passed not by minutes, but by the weight of routine, the patience of waiting, and the slow repetition of tasks that had no end, only pause. Imagine yourself waking in a cottage dimly lit by the early gray of dawn. The hearth is low, embers buried beneath ash. A soft draft creeps through the cracks in the wall. You hear the cockerel before you see it. Its call a thin sound across the fields. Somewhere not far off, the chapel bell tolls matins, the first mark of the day, long before the sun's light reaches the ground. You stir not from sudden energy, but because there is simply no choice. The fire must be coaxed back to life, the animals checked, the day begun. Morning comes slowly, even in summer. The peasant rises from a straw-stuffed mattress laid on a wooden frame, or sometimes from the packed earth itself, shared with children and often with livestock in the coldest months. The first act of the day might be to stoke the fire, or perhaps to walk to the well, the icy water shocking even calloused hands. Children, if old enough to walk, are already underfoot, and younger ones are wrapped in wool and placed near warmth. There is no breakfast as we know it, only a piece of yesterday's bread dipped in broth, perhaps with a small portion of cheese, if luck allows. The rhythm is practical. The day's shape bends to the needs of the season. In summer, work begins early, long before the sun heats the fields. There is hay to scythe, wheat to cut, or soil to turn. In winter, work is shorter, but harder in different ways. Mending tools, feeding animals in barns where cold clings to beams and breath forms clouds. For most, the bulk of labor happens between the 2nd and 6th hours after dawn. This was when the fields saw life, slow, deliberate, coordinated. Tools are shared, hands blister. The land responds, not with praise, but yield. Some might work their own strips of land, others that domain the Lord's fields to fulfill their obligation. Each row turned is part sustenance, part survival, part tribute. Time is marked by bells, those distant voices of the church, terse, sext, none. They echo faintly, like time breathing. But the peasant does not stop for prayer unless required. Work continues. Life, for all its closeness to religion, is first lived through the body. The midday meal is humble. Bread, onions, perhaps some salted pork if a pig had been slaughtered recently. Eaten not at a table, but on the ground, in the shade of a cart, or against a tree. Hands wipe sweat with the same cloth that holds the food. Conversation is sparse, not unfriendly, but focused. What needs mending? What did the reeve say this morning? Are the rains coming too soon? By afternoon, the body begins to tire. The sun no longer feels welcome. A back stoops further. There is still planting or dung to spread. Some peel away to tend animals or fetch firewood. Women may return to the cottage to begin preparing the evening meal. A thick pottage from whatever grows and a handful of dried beans. Children might gather wild greens or search for mushrooms at the edge of the woods, a knowledge passed not from books but from observation, repetition, and stories whispered by mothers and grandmothers. In the warmer months, the evening stretches longer. The golden hour bathes the village in a softness that makes even the worn fences and muddy paths seem gentle. Some neighbors linger near fences, speaking low about a sick cow or the new boy born to the widow. Older folks sit by the doorway, shelling peas or just watching the light fade. Their hands as gnarled as the oak trees that line the distant edge of the land. As the sun falls lower, shadows stretch across the fields. The rhythm slows, not from rest, but from exhaustion. Tools are cleaned with care, because the work will return tomorrow, exactly the same. There is no weekend, no retirement, only seasonal variation, sowing and reaping, cold and heat. And yet, there is satisfaction in knowing what to expect. There is peace in the ordinary. Evening brings the family together, not around a table, but near the hearth. The fire dances in the dim room. Its faces glow with amber light. This is when stories are told, softly, between bites, and never too long. Someone speaks of a neighbor's bad dream. Another repeats a tale of a man who met a spirit on the road. These are not diversions, but ways of making sense of a world that offers little clarity. The youngest fall asleep, curled on a sheepskin, a hand still clutching a pebble or straw doll. The eldest, eyes cloudy, but still knowing, speak in half thoughts, nodding as if two rhythms only they remember. And in the hush of the house, one might hear the gentle sound of water being poured to wash feet, cloth being wrung out for tomorrow's task. Sometimes there are moments of pause at the threshold. A man might stand at the doorway, gazing at the moonlit field, listening to the faint sounds of crickets or the far-off hoot of an owl. The land, so demanding by day, now rests, and so does he. But even in sleep, life does not pause entirely. Night in the medieval village was not quiet. Dogs bark, cattle shuffle, wind presses the roof. Fear lingers too. Fear of bandits, fear of fire, fear of sudden illness. The dark was not just an absence of light. It was a space where the unknown could take form, where footsteps on the road meant strangers, not guests. And yet the peasant slept, not always soundly, but deeply from labor. Sleep was not leisure. It was necessity. It came in two parts, a first sleep, and then, often, a quiet wakefulness before the second sleep. During that time, some prayed, some whispered, some stoked the fire and returned to dreams. Time did not rush. It moved in breath and sweat and ash. The rhythm of life, then, was circular, always returning, constant pulse beneath the uncertainty. Time was not owned. It was endured, honored, followed. Not a race, but a rhythm. And in this slow music of days, generations passed like seasons, each echoing the steps of those before, each leaving no monument but the worn path from hearth to field, from cradle to grave. And as the stars wheeled overhead, visible beyond thatched roofs and smoke-streaked skies, the rhythm continued, gentle, predictable, and enduring, a soft drumbeat that guided all things, sleep and waking, labor and rest, laughter and grief. It's a song of life in a quiet village where even silence had its own time of day. The air of the medieval village was thick, not only with the smoke of hearth fires and the scent of damp earth, but with a quiet, enduring awareness of the unseen. Belief was not a matter of choice, It was not debated over wine or dissected in written words, It simply was, stitched into every hour of the day, every shadow on the path, every silence between chores. Faith and folklore coexisted, intertwined, not in contradiction, but as parts of the same breath that animated the world. To live in the medieval world was to live in constant proximity to mystery. The soul was not something abstract. It was as real as a stomachache or a broken fence. It needed tending, protection, and healing. And so the peasant prayed, not only in church, but while kneading dough, tightening harnesses, or walking to the well. A whispered invocation might guard against a fever. A small cross, drawn with a thumb on a child's forehead, could hold back nightmares. Broken egg at the wrong time might carry an omen. The church was the great anchor. Its bells marked time. Its priests explained the will of heaven and the dangers of hell. For most peasants who could not read or write, the rituals of the church were their book. The feast days, the processions, the fasts, and to Mass. Latin words chanted in echoing stone halls were not always understood, but they carried meaning nonetheless. The incense, the candles, the solemn rhythm, these spoke in a language deeper than speech. Even the architecture of the church, the high ceilings, the stained glass light, reminded them of heaven, of something unreachable, yet present. Monks and friars, who traveled between villages, carried not only teachings, but stories. Stories of saints who suffered for faith, of miracles that defied logic, of visions seen by holy women who fasted and prayed until their hands bled. These tales became part of local memory. Villages were proud of nearby shrines, a well that healed warts, a hill where a saint once walked barefoot. Pilgrimage was not only for the rich. Even the poor would save coins for years to walk dozens of miles, hoping for grace. Life was not divided into sacred and secular. A plowed field could be holy ground if blessed in spring. A storm could be punishment or warning. A good harvest was never just the result of labor, but also of grace. Likewise, suffering was not always injustice. Sometimes it was a test, a cleansing, a mysterious part of the divine plan. But this faith was not always serene. Fear walked hand in hand with belief. Demons, the devil, witches. These were not metaphors. They were threats, real and immediate. A child with a fever might be bewitched. A cow that stopped giving milk could be cursed. Women who lived alone and knew herbs too well were sometimes accused of unholy powers. The church did not invent this fear, but it shaped it, offering prayers, exorcisms, rituals to ward off evil. Angels were near. Saints listened. The Virgin Mother was both distant queen and familiar protector. Statues in the chapel were worn smooth from the touch of fingers asking for help with childbirth, with cattle, with the safe return of her brother. And in homes, scraps of parchment with holy words were tucked above doors, or bits of bone, believed to be relics, were kept in wooden boxes. These were not superstitions, but safeguards. In a world where danger came swiftly and medicine healed rarely, the unseen was more dependable than the seen. Yet belief stretched beyond the church, into the soil, the forest, the sky. The old ways still lingered. Harm against a toothache might involve herbs and muttered words passed down from a grandmother who had never met a priest. People still buried nails beneath thresholds, scattered salt to purify, or turned shoes upside down to mislead malevolent spirits. At the edge of each village stood trees no one dared cut, core, stones, no one moved, places too old for memory, but still powerful. The changing of seasons carried spiritual weight. Solstices, harvests, and equinoxes were often woven with rituals, sometimes Christian, sometimes older. Bonfires on Midsummer's Eve, sprinkling fields with water before planting, dressing a child in a crown of flowers on May Day. These were gestures to forces half remembered, but deeply felt. Dreams mattered. A vision in the night could be a message. A crow at the window might mean death. A sudden wind during a birth might speak of more than weather. The world was not flat and knowable. It curved into hidden places. The veil between the living and the dead, the blessed and the cursed, was thin. Sometimes too thin. Funerals were among the most sacred moments. Death was both feared and expected, a gate through which all must pass. The body was washed, wrapped, prayed over, bells tolled. The grave was dug not only into the earth, but into the heart of the community. And after burial, candles might burn for days, and the family might fast or feed the poor in memory. But still, a chill might linger in the house, a presence not fully gone. Doors were kept closed at night, as children were told not to speak of the dead by name. In some regions, bodies were buried with coins to pay passage into the next world. In others, they were buried with tools, seeds, or small loaves of bread, as if they might still need to work or eat. Death was not an ending, it was a crossing. And for the living, remembering the dead meant keeping them close, offering prayers, lighting candles on anniversaries, and speaking their names in whispers. Religious festivals broke the rhythm of hardship. Candlemas, All Hallows Eve, Easter, Lent. Each carried symbolism that helped people mark the invisible journey of life. Children were told stories of saints and devils. Plays and processions brought sacred stories to life. Sometimes belief turned ecstatic, with visions, dancing, fasting, or flagellation. At other times, it was quiet, a mother folding hands while her baby slept. Yet, belief also brought comfort. It gave shape to the shapeless. It said, "You are not alone. You are not meaningless. Your suffering has purpose. Your joys are not fleeting. There is more than this life, and what you do here echoes into eternity." For a mother watching her child waste away, or a father returning to an empty hearth, that promise meant everything. And so they prayed, with words, with work, with silence. The whole village was a kind of chapel, floors of mud, ceilings of sky filled with tiny acts of hope, a loaf shared, a candle lit, a knee bent by the roadside. Beyond the veil of daily life, belief was the light they walked toward. It was not perfect, not always gentle, but it was constant, like breath, like heartbeat, like the land itself, deep, dark, and full of mystery. Imagine, now, that the soft light of late morning warms a well-trodden path leading out of a medieval village. The narrow trail winds through hedgerows, past open pastures where sheep graze with sleepy contentment, and into the uncertain terrain of neighboring lands. For the medieval peasant, the village was more than home. It was boundary, belonging, and protection. And yet, life occasionally brushed up against the edges of that boundary, sometimes in peace, sometimes in tension. Each village in medieval Europe was a world unto itself, yet it could not exist entirely in isolation. Trade, marriage, religious obligations, and the rare pull of opportunity meant that movement beyond one's home settlement was not unheard of. These excursions, though infrequent and often modest in purpose, could have lasting effects on how one village regarded another. Some interactions were simple and transactional. Traveling merchants arrived with carts jingling and dusty from long roads, bringing goods such as salt, cloth, tools, or even exotic items like dried fruit or foreign spices, always in minute amounts. Their scent clinging to the folds of linen like whispers from distant lands. These traders might set up on the edge of a green, their wares laid neatly upon a canvas, as curious children peeked out from behind mothers' skirts, and elders haggled with cautious reverence. In these moments, the village became momentarily porous, its walls lowered in the name of necessity and interest. Trade fairs and markets in larger towns brought more elaborate exchanges. A peasant might walk half a day's distance to reach such a place, carrying a basket of hens or sheaves of woven wool. These events were marked not only by commerce, but by the convergence of dialects, mannerisms, and values. The smells of roasted meat mingled with hay and sweat. Voices rose in cheerful argument, and, for once, even the poorest could feel part of something larger and visible thread binding countless villages in a tapestry of barter and coexistence. Yet, proximity could also breed distrust. Villages, though similar in construction, often maintained a fierce sense of their own identity. A bend in the river or a stand of ancient trees might mark where one parish ended and another began. And while these borders might seem trivial to us, they held significance steeped in custom and land rights. Disputes over access to a well, a pasture, or a footpath were common. Sometimes, these disagreements would be quietly managed dissolved by elders under the cool hush of a church nave, but other times, tempers flared. Imagine a spring morning where villagers from two nearby settlements both arrive at a disputed piece of land. Voices are raised. A stick is brandished. The disagreement may dissolve into scowls and silence, but occasionally it would escalate into a full-blown skirmish, nothing on the scale of battle, but sharp enough to leave bruises, broken tools, and bitter stories retold for decades. These minor feuds, often forgotten in grand histories, were part of the emotional landscape of peasant life. They were not merely about land or livestock. They were about pride, heritage, and the preservation of hard-won stability. In contrast, there were also moments of unexpected connection. Religious festivals or processions sometimes involved the entire region. On such occasions, villagers who might otherwise cast wary glances at one another would join in songs, prayers, and feasts. The shared language of faith softened borders. A child from one village might find herself holding hands with another during a candlelit vigil, or a young man might exchange glances with a girl he would later marry, thus binding to once distant places through human threads. Marriage itself was a powerful force of intervillage diplomacy. While most unions were local, occasionally a marriage would be arranged or inspired across village lines, bringing two families in by extension. to communities, to cautious kinship. These events were marked with ceremony and quiet watchfulness. Would this alliance bring peace or new tensions? Then there were the traveler stinkers, minstrels, and pilgrims wandering souls whose presence could both fascinate and frighten. They arrived with stories, songs, and strange accents. Some were welcomed, given bread and a place by the fire. Others, especially in times of scarcity or disease, were turned away with suspicion. For many peasants, outsiders symbolized both wonder and warning, and so a delicate balance was kept between curiosity and caution. Rumors, too, traveled. Stories of theft, strange omens, or mysterious illnesses from a neighboring village could color opinions for years. One poorly understood event, a barn fire, a sudden death, or a child gone missing, might be explained away as the fault of those people from over the hill, even if there was no proof. These narratives became part of oral lore, passed from grandmother to grandson, like lullabies of caution. When disease swept through a region, the fear of outsiders intensified. Doors were barred. Visits ceased. Even those who once traded bread and news were now seen as carriers of shadow. Yet, paradoxically, these very times also forced communities into shared vulnerability. A village that once competed for grazing land might now pray for its neighbor's health, knowing that fate moved like wind across the fields impossible to contain. In quieter times, relations between villages might settle into patterns of benign distance. People knew one another's names, perhaps even shared ancestors. But they also remembered past slights, perceived unfairness, or the old misdeed of a long-dead elder. Memory in medieval communities was long and vivid, passed from tongue to tongue in evening hushes beside the hearth. And still, among all this, moments of genuine friendship and alliance emerged. A plow, broken on the eve of planting, might be mended with a part borrowed from the next village. A healer sought to treat a difficult birth might be called across the stream. In these small moments, the web between communities was strengthened, not by decree or politics, but by shared humanity. So, as you drift into thought, or perhaps into the edge of sleep, picture this network of villages, each a quiet constellation on the darkened land. Their flickering hearts casting light into the distance, each with its own voice, rhythm, and pride. And yet, from time to time, their paths cross, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in conflict, but always shaping one another in ways both remembered and forgotten. In the soft hum of twilight, when the world began to fold into shadows and the last breath of sunlight gilded the rooftops with a tired glow, the earth beneath the farmer's feet was more than soil. It was a testament, a living record of steps taken not out of choice, but out of a quiet refusal to be erased. Resistance in the medieval village was rarely the kind sung about in bard songs or recorded in chronicles. It did not blaze with fire or clash with iron. It rustled like leaves in the wind, quiet but relentless. It was a grandmother who taught her granddaughter the old names of herbs in a whisper, even though the church now forbade such superstitions. It was a father who adjusted his son's plow just so, passing on a trick that saved time, and with it, a few extra breaths of rest. It was a mother who looked the bailiff in the eye and handed over less grain than required, her face unreadable. Adaptation, too, was not loud. It lived in the ways bodies bend to weather, in the tilt of a roof adjusted to favor a changing wind. Oh, in the shift of planting dates after 3 years of failed harvests. A woman, once scolded for singing pagan lullabies, turned them into harvest chants, sung while sowing seeds, so faith and survival could live side by side. Some forms of defiance were barely visible, even to those performing them. When a field yielded more than expected, not all of it reached the Lord's barn. A few baskets made their way into neighboring huts, no words exchanged, only nods. In winters so bitter, even hope seemed to freeze. These silent exchanges kept families alive. This was not charity. It was covenant. Children, too, learned this rhythm of unspoken loyalty. They knew when not to speak, when to hide, when to run ahead and signal the approach of unwanted eyes. They also knew who to trust: the widow who never turned away a knock, the boy with a limp who carried news better than the wind, the old man who kept maps no one asked for. Even illness became an act of resistance. In a world where sickness could condemn you to isolation or suspicion, some chose to heal in secret. A broth passed through the window under moonlight, a salve made from stolen time in patient hands. The village knew that healing did not always come with the priest's blessing. It often came with the courage to try, to touch, to hope against the decree of fate. And in the rare moments when resistance broke the surface, it did so not with trumpets, but with trembling. A group of peasants might refuse an increased tax. A field might be abandoned in protest, left fallow and silent. Sometimes entire families disappeared into the forest, seeking another life beyond the reach of scroll and sword. Yet for most, adaptation was the canvas on which daily life was painted. When drought lingered like an uninvited guest, the villagers dug deeper, waited longer, prayed harder. When flood came, they salvaged seeds from mud, hung blankets to dry, sang even as the river stole their shoes. In such a world, even the way one slept was an adaptation. Mothers learned to dream with one ear open. Fathers placed their bodies against doors, not for warmth, but for warning. Sleep was not surrendered, was a rehearsal for another day of bending, but not breaking. There were rituals of resilience, practiced in secret, stitched into garments, etched into walking paths, a pendant hidden in a blouse, a gesture made before drinking, a small loaf of bread shaped differently to remember someone lost. These rituals were not merely comfort, they were declarations. We remember, we continue. In the smallness of their acts lived a vast defiance. They danced at weddings as though the ground were theirs. They named their children after stars and trees, not saints, as though the divine might be found in the fields and forests. They wove their own stories when the official ones failed them. Some wrote, even when writing was forbidden, bits of poetry etched into barn walls, ledgers of lambs born and bread baked, love notes hidden under floorboards. They knew the written word could outlive even the strongest walls. To write was to say, I was here. Even the tools they used became extensions of resistance. A hoe passed from father to daughter, a knife sharpened for generations, a spindle carved with patterns that told a story no book ever would. These were not just tools, they were inheritance, memory, proof. At night, the sky watched over these quiet acts, and the stars, ancient and unjudging, bore witness to lives lived not with grandeur, but with grit. The constellations knew the names of those never recorded. They knew the weight of a calloused hand, the tremble of a forbidden prayer, the warmth of a shared blanket. What it meant to adapt was not simply to survive, right? It was to refuse to vanish. What it meant to resist was not to win, but to remain human in the face of forces that wished to reduce humanity to function, obedience, or silence. And so, their footprints remain not on marble floors or castle walls, but in the deep grooves of the earth, the fading edges of a worn path between huts, the hollow in a wooden bench, the shine on a stone where someone sat each morning to tie her boots. They are gone now, those people, but their resistance echoes in the wild herbs that still grow beside ruins, in the way language carries old words, in the songs mothers hum without knowing why. To live, then, was not easy, but they lived, fully, with eyes open to the sky and hands open to the soil. And in every act of bending, they chose not to break. What did it mean to be alive then? To wake, not by alarm, but by sound the rooster's cry, the bark of a restless dog, the shift of wind through timber cracks. Light leaked into the world slowly, never abruptly. It caressed the stones, stirred the dust, and kissed the foreheads of those already on their feet. You did not own time. Time swept over you like fog. It moved in rhythms you obeyed without question. The sun rose, and so did your body. The sun fell, and you dared not challenge the dark. Being alive meant you shared space. Not in the way we now speak of roommates and neighbors, but in the way breath is shared in crowded rooms. In the way every pot, every blanket, every silence was communal. The hearth was not simply where food was made. It was where warmth lived, where children gathered like moths, where elders spoke with hands, not just words, where memory floated on the steam of stew. To be alive then meant knowing limits, okay? You did not believe you could have everything. You believed in what you could touch, okay? You wanted enough flour, not more, okay? You prayed for a dry roof, not a palace. Desire was present, but small enough to carry in your palm. Hope was humble. You wore old shoes and smiled shyly. You worked not for fulfillment, but for continuation. The ox needed feeding. The field needed turning. The baby needed swaddling. The lace needed mending. Kay labored because life depended on it, not because you saw passion. Joy came later. Okay. Sometimes, never. But survival came first. There were songs. Oh, there were songs. Sung without instruments, passed from mouth to mouth like heirlooms. Work songs, love songs, morning songs. They were stitched into your days like seams in your clothes. You did not always know what they meant, but you knew how they felt. In faith, faith was not a debate. It was a blanket pulled over your fears, a candle lit in a storm. It was the sign of the cross made without thinking, the muttered prayer for a safe birth. Cave, the belief that someone somewhere saw you, even if no one else did. Faith was not loud, whispered in stone churches, in forest glades, in the stillness between breaths. To be alive then meant feeling things more slowly. Sorrow sat with you longer. Joy took time to bloom. Nothing was instant. Child's first steps were witnessed by many, not recorded. Goodbye was final, not revisited through pictures. Grief was carved into your bones. You did not move on you carried. There were no mirrors in every room. You did not know your face the way we do now. You knew your hands better, knew the calluses, the freckles, the shape of your own nails. You knew your back ached and your feet swelled. You did not need reminders of your body. It reminded you. To be alive meant witnessing nature, not as scenery, but as law. A storm could destroy months of work. A warm winter could bring rats. A hard frost could kill a child. Okay, you respected the sky because you had to. You read its moods like scripture. And when the stars appeared, you did not scroll past them. You looked up, you wondered, you waited for the moon to speak. A meal was not something you ordered. It was something you made, grew, traded for, waited for. A good meal was not about flavor, it was about having enough. Butter was a luxury. Salt was a gift. And when a stranger came to your door, you offered bread, even if it meant you had less. To be alive then was to be interwoven, not just with people, but with soil and smoke and sorrow. You did not strive to be remembered. You strove to endure. Legacy was not your name, was the strength of your daughter's back, it's the skill in your son's hands, the softness of your granddaughter's heart. Time moved differently. Years were counted by winter survived. Love was measured by the way someone waited for you in the cold. Regret came not from missed chances, but from words spoken in anger when silence would have sufficed. Children grew, not with milestones, but with seasons. A girl who milked her first cow. A boy who stopped crying when his father left. And when a child died, and many did, the grief was not lessened by its frequency. Each loss carved new hollows. Some were filled with faith. Some never were. To be alive then was to learn through doing, to teach by showing. Books were rare. Stories were everything. A story could warn, heal, delight, instruct, lead. They were shared beside fires, under trees, by bedsides. Lee, they traveled farther than their tellers. You were part of something older. The floor you swept was once swept by another. The bowl you ate from once held someone else's hunger. Nothing was yours alone. Even your grief was inherited. At night, fear grew larger, but it never felt sealed. You listened for wolves, for footsteps, for omens. You lit a candle, not to see, but to be seen by what was watching. The darkness was not empty. It held stories you were told never to speak aloud, and still slept, somehow, with the wind outside, with the loved one beside you, with your last thoughts held in prayer or silence or song. To be alive then was not noble. It was not tragic. It was not heroic. It was simply real. And in its realness, there was something sacred. Something we have not lost, only buried beneath noise and light. Something that waits in stillness, in repetition, in hunger and in hush. It's what it meant to be alive then. Not perfect, not easy, tamed, but enough.